This is the Tom Anderson Show, broadcasting live from the KVNT studios, 7 to 9 a.m., Monday through Friday.
Hey, we are back. Good morning, everybody. Tom Anderson Show live and local, 7 to 9 a.m., Monday through Friday, right here on KVNT. Always a pleasure. It's been a while to have one of my best buddies, Bryan Butcher, on. He's the head honcho of Alaska Housing Finance Corporation. Bryan, how long have you been in that gig? Dude, I remember when you were working under the great Dan Fauske, my first guest, October 1st, 2011, and we miss him every day, and now you're the head. How long have you been at AHFC?
I started working for Dan. He hired me 18 years ago, and I have been in the job of CEO about 8 years.
We want to talk about rental and basically, I won't call it a rebate, but what is the latest? Because I've read in other states that a lot of this funding from the federal government with the pandemic, we just heard from Zaz Hollander, if you were listening or not, talking about healthcare and all the problems, and the rental issue is an undercurrent and what's going on there. Big deal to me, elephant in the room nationally, is all this federal money, is it being allocated and distributed or not? And your PR team, awesome PR team, Laura and team, and then your staff reached out and said, we'll get Bryan on to discuss that. Do we have a big pot of money that's not been distributed? And if so, yes or no, how can people get their hands on it for support?
Yeah, we have the federal government in two different bills, one at the end of December, provided Alaska with $200 million to help folks that have been financially detrimentally impacted by the pandemic, whether they lost their job, reduced hours, health problems, bills, anything that has been detrimentally impacted you and you qualify. We received $200 million in the state, plus about $100 million to the tribal entities to help people not just with their back rent, but with their future rent. And then we received in the March rescue bill that passed an additional $152 million. So that's a lot of money for a state with a small population like Alaska. And so we had an opening for people to sign up that needed it back in March. We had about a third of all of the rental units in the state sign up, which is good and bad. I mean, the bad is the incredible need in Alaska is that 1 out of every 3 renters has been impacted and has needed help. The positive is we got the word out and we have the funds available to help them. And so Alaska has been one of the national leaders in getting the money out. We tried to streamline it. We tried to not make it overly bureaucratic. So we've gotten out about $130 million, which is more than most states over the last 6 months, and we have an additional amount obligated, but we still have a lot more money available. So as of right now, we have another opening for those people that might have missed the first window to sign up for the program, or maybe their financial situation has gotten worse than it was in March, and they don't feel like they didn't feel like they had the need in March, but they do now. You can sign up. You get on. It's very simple. The website is alaskahousingrelief.org. You can also get there from AHFC's website, and you can check your eligibility. And if you're eligible, you kind of go through kind of a really 5 to 10 minute intuitive process to figure out if you can receive some assistance.
When I look at the national playing field, you just gave props and some credit to Alaska, what you guys have done at AHFC, getting the money out and distributed per capita, like we talk about in healthcare. It's the same with housing and how many people relative to the state, relative to the size and all of that. But one complaint unrelated to you and AHFC in Alaska that we reported on a while back was that the apartment complex owners, and I know you can't speak for the federal government, but I just wanted to get your take on this from afar, unrelated to here. Apartment complex owners, building owners, they were like, hey, what gives? We've got renters. This was like over a year ago, and I wanted to ask you this off air, but I'll ask it now. You know, they're getting rental assistance, or they're allowed to not pay rent. I can't evict them, and then all of a sudden I'm not getting compensated. So they're covered. They can't be evicted. They don't pay rent, but how do I pay the mortgage for this apartment complex? Did you see that? Observe that? Did it happen here at all? And I know that's unrelated to HFC. It was a federal issue, but was that a problem?
Yeah, absolutely it happened here because you're right. Landlords, and most of the landlords in the state aren't these huge corporations that have thousands and thousands of apartments. Most of them are mom and pops. They still have to pay their property taxes. They still have to pay their utilities. They still have to pay all the things you have to pay by being a landlord. But with the eviction moratorium, they weren't receiving any of the funds. So first of all, this program goes directly to the landlords and to the utility companies. They don't go to the renter with the hope that the renter pays what they owe. And also, we tried very hard to keep in contact with the landlords. Even in situations where we were processing paperwork, we'd put letters out saying, your tenant, this tenant's been approved. We're in the process of getting the funds out to let them know, okay, you might not have received your payment now, but it's on its way. And virtually every renter that applied in the spring, those landlords have received funds on behalf of those renters. There are a few cases that we haven't had the paperwork or we had the wrong bank routing numbers for the landlords that haven't been paid. But for the most part, everybody that needed the help has gotten help.
Which is great to hear. How do you see this play out in the coming months? I mean, with that type of money, that bank account sitting there, are you expecting a swath of people to pop in with interviews like this? And secondly, have you questioned why there's not more folks applying for it? And I'll answer one of those. So one is, what do you see in the next couple of months? And two, why didn't we see more in the past? One is branding, and I'm not talking about local agencies, but I'm talking about generally the branding. Nobody knows where to go or what to do. And I don't so much mean that with you at AHFC, but at a national level. I think people were like, I didn't realize I could get that. Either they're not paying attention or branding in certain states was not robust enough. But where do you see this play out next couple months, and why haven't we seen more in the past of applications?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I feel like I said, when a third of the renters signed up, we feel like we got the information out pretty well. We're continuing to do it with the second round. But in a lot of the lower 48 states, we had states with larger populations than Alaska's just have a fraction of people applying, and they were curious as to why it was going on because they knew people were in need. And I think a lot of it did have to do with not kind of figuring out where do we advertise, how do we get information out to people. The traditional put something in the newspaper and think that the average Alaskan's going to get it. That might have worked 20 years ago, but it doesn't really work today. And then I also think in the state, a lot of people, and hey, I totally get this, are thinking, I don't need help from a federal program. I've never needed help from a federal program. And what we've tried to emphasize is this was a shutdown of the economy. As an example, if you worked in tourism, the Canadian border was shut down. So we're not having tourists come that way. The cruise lines were shut down. So many things happened were detrimental that people are in real financial need through no fault of their own. And this is the federal government trying to say, we understand the ramifications of the decisions. Now we want to help to make sure you're not so deep in debt that you spend years getting out of it. And so that's one thing we're really emphasizing. Another thing I think sometimes people have said, well, I'd rather the federal money not be used and go back to help with the deficit or reduce taxes or whatever. And in this program, that's not the way it works. Any dollars that Alaska doesn't use goes back and gets redistributed to California or New York or Illinois or some of the areas that need it. So there is no good reason why every Alaskan that needs the help doesn't get it.
Do you see the typical statistical higher in Anchorage, next in Mat-Su, next in Fairbanks? Mat-Su is a little bit bigger, larger in population now than Fairbanks. Overtook it like 3 or 4 years ago in the low hundred of thousands. Then Southeast, maybe Kenai Peninsula. Do you see that? Is it parallel with population centers, the applications, and the distribution of money?
Yeah, we really have seen it that way. And in fact, I think it skews a little bit more towards urban because there's more rental units. When you get out into, say, some of the villages, there's not a lot of apartments or rental units most people own, so you're not going to see a lot of help with rent relief there. As an example, in the Mat-Su, we saw 2,400 applications in our first round, and since we opened the second round, we've had already 500 residents from the Mat-Su check their eligibility.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, and so we know there's still a need, and we're just trying to get the word out to, even if you don't know or you don't think you might, it doesn't hurt to check, see, and that way, you can get the help that you need, and also, like I said, not redistribute our federal money to every other state in the country.
Which makes sense. I have a couple other questions. I know he can stick with us for a few more minutes. Bryan Butcher is his name. He's the CEO of Alaska Housing Finance Corporation. I want to get into what's on the horizon beyond this renter relief and working with governments and city governments and Native Corps. He has a big job, and he's helping a lot of Alaskans, so got to be proud of that. Stay with us with Bryan Butcher, Tom Anderson Show.
This is the Tom Anderson Show, broadcasting live from the KVNT studios, 7 to 9 a.m., Monday through Friday.
We are back. Good morning, everybody. Remember, it is September 21st, Tuesday, 2021, and it snowed. That really sucks. I don't like snow, especially in September. I would like to actually have it be 80 degrees and go out on my lake and maybe use the wave runner, or I don't know what I'd like to do, but I really don't want to drive on snow and ice. But be careful out there as you drive. Bryan Butcher continues with the second segment. He's the CEO of Alaska Housing Finance Corporation, longtime legislative aide and advocate and consultant, and wonk now in housing for many years. And Bryan, first on the snow, did you drive to work slipping and sliding, or was it fairly safe in Anchorage?
It was fairly safe. In West Anchorage, where I live, there wasn't any snow, and by the time I got to East Anchorage, there was some snow, but not too bad.
Good. Yeah, the same here in the valley. It's melting. In fact, I was looking outside. Snow has melted for the most part, thank goodness, because it's heating up. Okay, before the break, we were talking about, why are people not applying? You explained there's information sources, education, knowledge, how we reach to them. And yes, you were a little surprised that more didn't reach out, but you were also comfortable with the numbers in comparison to other states, and nationally, Alaska seems to have a thriving application synergy there. Now let's get into, someone contacted us and asked the question, what if you have someone applies with you with AHFC for the federal funding, and they say, hey, I'm a landlord, we had a renter, deadbeat renter that after a couple months left, can they apply and get that back rent paid to me? How does that play out, and is it that simple, or does the renter that did not pay have another source in mind to pay, like their current apartment?
Yeah, and that's a good question. The way the program has been set up, it needs to be signed off on by the renter because the renter has to qualify as well as the landlord. But what slowed the process down of us going through is we have had some people want to move out because we have a set amount of, for the previous opening, it was 12 maximum of 12 months of assistance. And with this new opening, it's going to be a maximum of 3 months, and if we have enough funds available, it may go from there. But they have looked at, hey, I'd rather move to a different apartment and have this assistance help me into the future instead of maybe using most of my assistance for the past, and we have had to stop and make sure that we work through that and don't let that happen, that there aren't landlords that are that need their payment that are being skipped because somebody happened to move. And so it's an issue that we are dealing with. Even if somebody's moved out of their apartment, it's going to be on their record that they have walked away from 6 months or 9 months or whatever it is they owe. So there's no good reason for them not to benefit this program by getting that paid off, so they don't have that on their credit report anymore.
Makes sense. Before the break, I also asked Bryan Butcher, CEO of Alaska Housing Finance Corporation, what other programs are forthcoming that people should be aware of, and maybe you can give the contact info. Also, we'll make a YouTube video of this, and we'll put this interview in our podcast, and within those both, there's description with notes, and I can put the links to whatever you reference. But what are other programs forthcoming?
Yeah, there have been a lot of questions when rent relief happened from homeowners saying, hey, I lost my job or I've had some financial difficulties. How about help for us? We have a program that's will be starting this fall for a mortgage relief program, which helps people that are having difficulty paying their mortgages. It was set up, it's federally funded as well, but it was set up in a different way. With this program, we have to submit a plan to the U.S. Treasury. They have to approve it and get back to us. So I can't tell you exactly when that program is going to kick off because it's U.S. Treasury has not approved any of the 50 state plans yet, but we're hopeful that we're going to hear in the next month. And as soon as that happens, we're going to get out. We're going to, get on your show, do everything we can possibly do to let people know about the program because, again, that's $50 million of federal funds for Alaska that will just go someplace else if it's not used to benefit Alaskans in need.
Yeah, that makes sense. When we look at Alaska across the board and all the different regions, you cover the gamut. You work with whom? You work with federal, state, local, native? Are there too many to mention in terms of other entities that you work with in parity, collaboration, partnership to house people and protect them?
Yeah, we really do work with a number of federal agencies from HUD to the Department of Energy. We run all the public housing in the state. We have about a quarter of the mortgages in the state, so we work with U.S. Treasury, we work with the IRS, and then we work with many state agencies and many local governments as well. So we're all over the state. Every area of the state has different needs, and we try to do what we can do to help those particular areas get the help they need to help with housing.
So people understand, not to get too wonky or bureaucratic, but what's your biggest funding source? Is it a mix of federal and state? I mean, are you working with lawmakers? You were there as an aide and chief of staff for many years and budget guru. Do you have to work with them, policymakers, the gov, mayors, or does it just depend on what the issue is? Or all of the above?
About 2/3 of our funding is federal funded to run the corporation, and the other third is money that we make on our mortgages. So we don't use any state general funds for AHFC. In fact, we pay a dividend. 75% of what we make every year gets paid in a dividend to the state of Alaska. And so we've paid over $2 billion to the state in the last 20 years to help with some of the needs they have, capital projects. We've done everything from roads with DOT to buildings of schools and a number of other things. So when somebody gets an Alaska housing mortgage, not only are we going to work with them if they have issues a lot closer than Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would in D.C., but they also know that their payments are being redistributed back to the state to benefit them in different ways.
We're talking with Bryan Butcher, CEO of AHFC, Alaska Housing Finance Corporation. One other question. So as we look at, and I'm a statistic guy, a data guy, at our ad agency, our specialty is digital, so we're always looking at metrics and analytics and this, again, wonky stuff on numbers and try to assess conversions, try to assess what are we doing compared to other a client, let's say a plumber, a doctor, compared to others in state and out of state. Do you do that at AHFC? Do you look at other states and their housing programs and what works, what doesn't? And have you noticed an uptick or success comparatively, not to toot your own horn, in Alaska versus other states?
Yeah, we do, because the programs we run, whether they're federal public housing programs or housing finance, first-time home buyer loans, every state has an equivalent of something like Alaska Housing that they work, and so they learn from us, we learn from them. We have a very robust national group. In fact, I'm on the board of directors of it right now, and trying to make sure that if anybody has a good idea, that everybody benefits. Although I do have to say, Alaska Housing is kind of at the forefront, and there's been articles written about rent relief that kind of highlights that. We have a great team here. They've been around for a long period of time, and when we get things like these programs as a result of the pandemic, we really hit the ground running, and it's worked out pretty well so far.
Probably the biggest question of the show before we cut you loose to Bryan Butcher. Minnesota Vikings, can they win it all this year?
All I have to say about that is the Vikings are playing the same way this year that they seem to play every year.
Every year. Do you think Mike Zimmer I like him. Don't results matter, though? And I don't want to pick on him. I'd love to interview him at some point. But, could he be bumped as a result of this? That's always an expectation, or at least a possibility, right, if they really crap out this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, injury problems or hard luck at ends of games, I think people understand that. But, when it happens 1 or 2 years, that's one thing. But when it starts to happen numerous years, you begin to wonder if maybe a culture change is a positive. So I'm a fan of the guy, too, but they've had a rough go.
No, they definitely have. Well, I appreciate, as always, you're a buddy off air and on air. It's delightful to hear success because of your hard work and your team. And it's really encouraging to see that there are programs like this and a lot of money left over. And I think it's inspirational that government can work. And sometimes you get picked on, not you specifically, but government. You're quasi-government and a lot of other things, but you're delivering for Alaskans. I encourage people to go to AHFC. And last thing, Bryan, I know you'll concur. Don't just look at the 2 programs you mentioned. There are all sorts of programs. We're out of time now to go over them, but right? If someone perused AHFC's website, they would see things maybe they weren't aware of.
Yeah,
Is that fair?
It's always good to see. A lot of times people don't think there's better to check than not. If there's one other thing I could add real quick, the deadline for signing up for rent relief is next Friday, October 1st at 11:59 p.m. So please get on this week or next week.
Absolutely. Bryan Butcher, CEO, AHFC. Thank you, my friend. Drive safe out there. Folks, it's the Tom Anderson Show. Thanks so much for listening. Charlie Kirk is next up. Have a great day and God bless.